All right, hello everybody, and welcome to the Heady Livestream. I'm your host, Eli Harrington. We are here at our fancy new digs, Jam Creative, here in Burlington's South End Arts and Business District. Thank you very much to Monica and Judd and Chris and everybody else for hosting us here in our beautiful space. As you guys can see, we have a special guest tonight, Mr. Tim Fair, founder of Vermont Cannabis Solutions. We're going to talk about the changing laws in Vermont. We're going to say whatever disclaimers we need to say because this will not be official legal advice, right?
Of course. None of this, what we're talking about tonight, will be considered legal advice. But.
None of this will be considered legal advice. So I'll say that about 1,000,000 times just to cover our butts here. But we're going to get into it with Tim. We've already got a bunch of questions lined up. Before we get into that, like I said, we just want to give an introduction and thank our hosts here, Jam Creative, the new studio. Big shout out to Sean Simonetti Productions. You guys see all these fancy camera angles. You guys see this beautiful setup. Sean, amazingly talented young local guy who is here, makes this all look so good. So
thank you, Sean.
Thank you very much to Sean, and thank you to Monica. We've got going live on Instagram as well. So hello to everybody out there on Instagram. We want to start, as we usually do, with a little Vermont update. And we're going to start with something that's near and dear to both of our hearts, the Vermont Cannabis and Hemp Convention, May 12th and 13th. We just put the news out. The vendor booths sold out.
Completely
sold out. All of the
space.
It is the biggest event that we've done in Vermont. This event is going to be at least twice as large as Hemp Fest. So if you were there at Burke in September, imagine that times 2 at least. So we have been working on this. Nick from Greener Mountain Consulting has been a partner with us. The New England Cannabis Convention, thank you to Mark and Jeff for involving us in their first trip up here to Vermont. So that's happening May 12th and 13th. We've got we've definitely got over 65 booth spaces all filled. A ton of sponsors. Ceres Natural Remedy just upgraded to one of the educational sponsors in the event. So thank you to Ceres. We've got, like I said, huge slate. There's a lot of information online. We'll be talking about that for the next few weeks to come. But I want to mention that because that's something that we've been talking about. Tim, you with Vermont Cannabis Solutions, with Nick from Greener Mountain Consulting, who I know is always tuning in on the live stream.
Well, what's so nice about that is we've all been able to bring, something different to the table and really, I think, add to what Nikan's been so successful at. Well,
and making sure, we've had a lot of questions that we've had to answer from vendors about what you can do in Vermont. Because this is a regional show. It's not just Vermont people. We're going to talk about what's legal in Vermont, and people who read Heady Vermont, follow Vermont Cannabis Solutions on Facebook, they know. But everybody coming from out of state has questions. And so that's been a great service you've been able to provide this event already, which dovetails nicely into the rest of what we'll talk about. And like I said, people have questions. Disclaimer, this is not legal advice. This will not be considered legal advice. But you can drop those questions in here. Into the comments.
If you don't mind, Eli, let me explain why it's not legal advice.
Yes,
because
please.
We are going to be giving some basic legal principles, talking about the laws. But unless a lawyer, myself, or anyone knows the specific details of your situation, it's impossible to give broad, generalized legal advice because it really does change in every single set of circumstances.
And tonight, we'll kind of talk about these are what the shape of the laws are.
Exactly.
This is the letter of the law. This is the spirit of the law.
And then it may be interpreted sometimes 2 different ways.
That's right. And that's why you, with your specific questions, got to hit up Vermont Cannabis Solutions. That's what we do. I'll give you guys a little peek behind the curtain here. Vermont Update, we're talking about events. A lot of questions about planning events, especially on July 1st, post-July 1st. So we're going to find answers to a lot of these questions. And we're going to do it by preparing in advance, not by calling you when we need to make bail afterwards. So, again, great reason to talk about this. I want to mention, just because of the seasonal changes, a lot of people are making hemp moves. This is big news in Vermont. The Vermont Hempicurian just opened up in Brattleboro. We want to give Scott a shout out.
Scott's a great guy.
Loyal supporter. They just had their opening today. So there is now another place, brick and mortar. Ceres has a shop down there as well. So with Southern Vermont, we're starting to build those anchors.
Around the state.
And hopefully the event, the Farmers Market, which you guys see behind me here, on Father's Day, on June 17th, that'll be another step forward. So big things are happening all over the state with hemp. Our trivia question tonight, I'm going to do a trivia question tonight because we're going to do trivia. So I'll work that in afterwards. It's going to be a hemp-related trivia question. So there's your little sneak peek. But again, we want to talk about events coming up. The Vermont Cannabis Convention, May 12th and 13th. That is the biggest. That's going to be huge. Tickets are on sale. You can get a weekend pass for $30 if you buy in advance. And we've got discounts for veterans, for students, and we may even do one for senior citizens. I don't know, because this event's going to be open to everybody, and it's going to be huge. So other big events coming up, the month of April. I don't know if you've heard in the legal community, 420.
I've heard that date somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, is this a real thing? Is code 420, is that a real thing, or is that just an urban legend? Is there really a code 420?
Not that I'm aware of, but that would be a localized thing. Supposedly, I've heard it was in San Francisco back in the 60s, and you just never know with these things.
So you as, like, Tim is teaching a continuing law education course, Vermont Law School, and involved in sharing what he's learned about Vermont cannabis laws. So this hasn't come up yet.
Just to get things clear, I've actually been asked to come down and guest lecture for one particular class at VLS, but we just did our first continuing legal education course through an independent company here in Vermont, the very first cannabis law one, which was exciting.
Oh, okay. So an independent company working with you guys and then working through Vermont Law School.
Well, no, not affiliated with Vermont Law School at all. It was a private for-profit company.
All right, good. See, that's how you know he's a good lawyer. Make sure we have all those disclaimers laid out there.
Absolutely.
Okay, good. So make sure that's clear. But I know that you are doing continuing legal education.
Absolutely.
And that this is becoming more and more of a thing. So again, we'll get into that. But want to give a preview, 420, we've got a ton of events coming up. We're going to do a trivia night. You were at the first trivia night, actually, at the Monkey House. We had a great time.
Trivia
night
on
You brought Gretchen with you as well. Shout out to the lovely Gretchen. And actually our whole studio audience here. If you guys want to, like, applaud and, like,
Fantastic.
Want to make sure these guys know that we're doing it big here in the studio audience. We'll have camera 4 up there at some point so you can see the whole hundreds of people over here in the live studio audience. All right, so like I said, we're going to do trivia, 418 at the Monkey House. Green Empire Brewing are going to be sponsoring that. It's going to be a benefit as well for the Ian Fund. Really happy to work with them. And we've got Humble Roots Horticulture confirmed as well. So save the date, Wednesday, April 18th. I'm going to give you guys a trivia question. This will be from the trivia night itself. I'm actually going to use one. You can't use this. You can't say the answer because I used this question at the last trivia night. So it has been asked before. As you know, there were about a dozen people there who came out in the snowstorm. So I think everybody else on Facebook, it'll still be fresh. One of the categories we did was Potney Botany. So we are going to give the winner of the trivia tonight, we're going to give him a free Heady Vermont t-shirt.
Right on.
We've got these Smoke Local t-shirts that you see modeled over here. We have them in men's cuts as well. So the winner tonight is going to get one of those. To win it, just answer correctly in the comments. I'll ask you right now. Whoever answers it first, I will go ahead and drop the question in. The category was Potney Botany. The question is, what do the acronyms SOG and SCROG stand for? SOG, SOG, and SCROG, SCROG. Those are our trivia questions tonight.
Do you have to get them both?
What do SOG and, yes, both of them.
Both for the t-shirt.
Yes, you have to get them both, and whoever answers it first, I dropped it in there. Go ahead and drop it in. We'll monitor the questions, and I'll announce the winner when we have the winner.
There we go.
But I don't want to hold us up because you're actually the star of the show tonight here, Tim. Nobody's tuning in to ask for my non-legal advice. Looks like we got Rolling Flower, said Sea of Green, Greener Mountain Consulting, Sea of Green and Screen of Green. Greener Mountain Consulting, congratulations. You have won a shirt for being the first. Oh, and we've got David in there as well. I think we're going to cut David in too. David's a longtime viewer, so.
Do we have 2 t-shirts?
Yeah, we have more. Yes, exactly. At least 2 t-shirts. We'll give the ladies cut to Greener Mountain Consulting.
Oh, yeah, Nick.
And they can share it. So, let's get into a little bit of an introduction more about you, Tim. Kind of, what's your background? We know that you founded Vermont Cannabis Solutions. People have seen the article in Ganjapreneur. They've heard the interview, which was awesome. If you haven't heard that yet, I'll drop the link in. Make sure to check that out. But maybe you can give us a little bit of background and how you've come to now be described as Vermont's first cannabis lawyer.
Well, I guess graduated law school in 2012. Was fortunate enough to get a job immediately in what I really wanted to be doing at the time, which was criminal defense. I knew I wanted to be a trial attorney. I knew I wanted to be in a courtroom. And I landed a dream job with a fantastic firm in downtown Burlington, right where I wanted to be, practicing the law I wanted to practice. And for the last 5 years or so, it's been fantastic. However, in 2016, I started looking out west, seeing where things were developing in Colorado, in California, in the legal states, and I started becoming fascinated by the industry. I've always been an advocate for drug policy reform, specifically cannabis reform. Been a major driver of my life for a while. I started out when I was 17 attempting to form a chapter of NORML at Nassau Community College in Long Island.
Okay.
Unsuccessfully, unfortunately,
All
at
right.
the time. Wasn't real big fans back in 1994. But, flash forward to now, and seeing the industry develop, seeing the tide turn on cannabis has just, it really got me inspired. And I started learning as much as I could about the industry.
Well, and I think anybody who's met you even briefly can tell your passion, right? And that you are a social justice advocate, a criminal justice reform, and that you seem like somebody who's driven by kind of righting wrongs, that you see. And I mean, I know we talk, and you're very passionate about cannabis DUI, for
Definitely.
example.
That's
And kind of like, I know that's part of one of the things that you've been discussing, and we'll talk about July 1st laws and growing and seeds and all that fun stuff after, but as somebody who's been involved in criminal defense, cannabis DUI is something we've seen more and more of, and that we're going to see a lot more of.
Absolutely,
probably in the next few years.
We're
A
gonna see a
lot
bunch
more
of it.
enforcement. Prepare for that. Get ready.
No question.
Maybe you can kind of give us a little primer on any experience you've had with cannabis DUI. And just sort of, I know it's a huge box of worms to open up, but it seems like an okay place to start as a guy who's,
Sure, and I think it's going to be something that's going to affect a lot of different people in a lot of different ways. I was fortunate enough to be able to take one of the very first prosecutions for this case to trial in Addison County last year, and won. We got a not guilty verdict in about an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours.
Wow.
Wasn't too long at all. And the reason for that was basically because as it currently stands, the way the state and law enforcement chooses to pursue these prosecutions, it doesn't satisfy the jury. And a colleague of mine actually had one of the very first trials of these several weeks before mine, also not guilty. And we were able to talk to a few of the jury members afterwards and found out that there's a lot of similar sentiments in both juries. And that was, they wanted to see the science behind it. It's not enough to say or even prove that someone consumed cannabis.
Right.
When there's no sign of erratic operation, when there's no poor driving, when there's no violations of any traffic law.
Right. And this is like when we get into the legal definitions, and we've talked a lot about this with saliva testing, right? The presence of THC in somebody's bloodstream versus their actual impairment. And the conventional approach has been that, if you get pulled over because your taillight's out and it smells like marijuana, it smells like detected the odor of burnt marijuana in your car, then that theoretically could trigger a lot of things. Is that something that, there's a lot that people sort of would like to see changed with these laws, but is that something that's going to change? Come July 1st, as the law is written, how is search and seizure going to change? Or it seems like there's a lot. Police are going to have a lot of leeway.
Well, I don't know. I wouldn't necessarily police are going to have a lot of leeway. I think what you're going to see is that the established norms that have existed in terms of cannabis are all going to get turned upside down. The Supreme Court, which is the ultimate arbiter of these type of questions, is going to have to use a new analysis. Prior to July 1st, before, cannabis is still considered contraband, even decriminalized. After we removed criminal offenses for quantities under an ounce, it still remains a civil violation, meaning that police can confiscate it. And that when the question of whether or not cannabis in its decriminalization still constituted probable cause for search warrants, the Vermont Supreme Court said yes. And which was in opposition actually to a Massachusetts case.
Right, and I think Arizona actually said that too.
I'm not
surprising,
quite
but
sure.
I know
I've
other
argued
states
the
are looking, but
Massachusetts
like,
case, but yes.
can you get into a car based on smelling, based on smelling marijuana?
And
right?
because, for the most part, criminal law is determined at the state level, these questions are, for the most part, answered by individual state Supreme Courts. And you can definitely have states that go different directions on it. Now, however, when the analysis is that cannabis is now a legal substance, be it regulated, but legal, that changes everything. That changes the game. That changes the entire analysis. So a lot of these type of cases, we're going to be arguing to the Supreme Court and seeing what they got to say.
Well, and that's I think a good place to start with July 1st laws, because we talk about this and what's going to be, what's going to change. And I can't imagine how many questions you get based on the number that I get. Questions that start with, as we titled our live stream tonight, is it legal to? Will it be legal to do X? What I tell people, this is not legal advice. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not going to say that too many times tonight. What I say is that the law's brand new. There haven't been any arrests or cases, so there's not really precedent.
Exactly.
So there's not really. If anybody tells you they can answer that question 100%, they're probably selling you a false bill of goods.
Either they're selling a false bill of goods, or they honestly and truly believe what they're saying, but they'd be incorrect.
Right.
A lot of this is going to be a case of first impression.
Right.
The whole framework of the law is based on the establishment of precedent. If a higher court rules it, you follow it. Stare decisis, this is just the way things are done. Cannabis law, however, doesn't have that precedent. Not yet. Right. There are some cases, starting to see some, especially in terms of the IRS tax court. Couple of issues of interpretation for 280E. But in terms of criminal law, this is a lot of brand new territory, and you're going to see different states come to different conclusions.
Right, and ultimately, what happens on the side of the road, what you believe based on what you read and what happens on the side of the road, may be totally different things.
Absolutely.
And again, that's why we're going to talk about on July 1st. We had talked about having kind of a Know Your Rights workshop. And so that's going to be a big part of what we hope to provide more of in the future too, is kind of that education for people to at least understand what their basic rights are, so that they are not going to unintentionally, incriminate themselves or misrepresent what they're doing based on a false misunderstanding, right?
Absolutely. I think, public education is going to be an important component of any business coming up into this industry right now. It's so developing, and it's not even just, educating those who support us with Know Your Rights. It's educating the 40% of the state that really opposed this. And, I think by kind of focusing education on both groups, we're going to really bring the industry together.
Right. Well, and you give advice and consultation as well. That's also not legal advice. But, as far as just people who are starting businesses, planning events, this is something that we think about with planning events, and as we plan ahead for longer term events, right, is kind of being proactive, and talking to people in the community.
Right. Well, we want
because ultimately, like what your local, the first impression, like you said, right? If the people in Essex think that our July 1st event is going to be Cheech and Chong or is going to be 420 at UVM, they're going to have a much different impression. But if we can come out and be proactive and say, actually, here's what we're looking at,
That's what we
or
want to do.
whatever kind of event you might be planning. What do you kind of give people for advice when they're thinking about, hey, I want to open up a cannabis business in this town, or I want to talk to somebody about having an event? Like, how far should I go?
Yeah, and I mean, that's a lot of questions.
Yeah.
But the basic theme is collaboration. We don't want confrontation. It's a new industry. There are still people who are operating under a lot of misconceptions. Misperceptions, misconceptions, whether it's been, propaganda they've heard or things that somebody's told them, or just long-held assumptions.
Yeah.
So we don't want confrontation. We don't want fighting. We don't want people coming in and going, I have the right to open a business here. Rather, approach the town. Go to select board meetings, go to town councils, whatever structure your particular area has, and talk to people. Find out what it is they're concerned about. Do they think it's going to bring crime? Do they think it's going to have attract other drugs? Find out what the concerns are, and then see if they can be reasonably addressed. Right. Sometimes they'll be very valid concerns. Sometimes it'll turn out that the concerns are based in less than fact. But
we could probably talk for hours just about the conversations that we've had with people who do have a lot of those misperceptions.
But that's going to be key, collaborative.
And generally speaking, I think most people who are going about this, Vermont, kind of the culture is more collaborative in that, in other states, people are sort of like, I'm going to start this business and I'm going to start a delivery company, and I'm just going to do it and send it in. In Maine and Massachusetts, there has been a lot more leeway. In Vermont, I think our culture is a little bit more conservative, ironically, sort of this Yankee sense of...
You have Burlington and the rest of Vermont.
Lower key, yeah, exactly, yeah, especially outside of Chittenden County. So we've got a bunch of specific questions. I'm going to start with, the first one I want to talk about is personal growing.
Sure.
And then I want to talk about gifting versus selling. Maybe we'll throw a hemp question in there after too. But so the way that the law is written currently, you would be allowed, as of July 1st, per dwelling, so it doesn't matter how many people live in your house, but per dwelling, you would have 2 mature plants, 4 immature plants.
That is correct.
At any given time.
That is correct.
So one of the first questions that we get is, what is a mature plant versus what is an immature plant? They said in here, the mature plant, so I'll save you the hard part because I already read this one. The mature plant is anything with buds.
Anything with buds, but that could also be interpreted in a lot of different ways.
Well, and here's the other thing too. We have a lot of people who read Heady Vermont, who follow us, who know a lot about cultivation.
Yep.
And their definitions are much more specific than what the courts might decide, and definitely much more specific than what, Sheriff Jones, who knocks on your door,
and that's ultimately
is going to decide.
Concern.
And that's ultimately what's going to be the factor here.
Well, you have to remember that, Sheriff Joe there is one step, but he has to make his determination as to whether or not in his mind it constitutes a crime. But the ultimate decision is actually made by a county state's attorney or the deputy state's attorneys.
Right.
All charging decisions in Vermont come from that office, not from the police. The police put forth recommendations based on their investigations. They submit evidence to the state's attorney, but ultimately it's up to that county state's attorney to decide whether or not to prosecute and bring charges.
Well, and again, understanding this is not legal advice, disclaimer, this is not legal advice, trying to give people a sense of the spirit of the law in advance so they can be responsible, right? So you've got 2 mature plants and 4 immature plants per household. Now, 4 immature plants, that would probably be anything that doesn't have a bud, right? Anything that, people ask about seeds. If I have clones in water, they don't have roots in soil. Do those count as mature plants, or are those like seeds?
These are tons of questions that are going to be answered. In the federal system, they do look at root structure and the survivability of the individual sprout and whether or not it would have a root structure which could survive on its own to determine whether or not, for the instance of clones. But as far as the state, we're not even close to that sophisticated yet. In fact, the law just says mature and immature, and I believe it does give a very basic definition, but budding, does that the actual, budding the flowers, is that the budding the leaves?
Are we talking flower, veg, cherry?
Exactly, in so many different ways. But really, even missing kind of the bigger picture is, who's going to ever know? It's not like law enforcement's going to have the ability to just come inside random houses to check to see whether or not they're mature or immature. It almost seems to be, to me, a silly distinction. This is just...
By the time you're in your house, they've already determined that you're doing something worth investigating.
If so, right. If Plainview Doctrine, if they came in for some other reason, justifiably, whether it would be a warrant or consent, and happened to see that and happened to notice, and and then again, is that going to be a violation? Is that going to be, how is it going to be interpreted by the court? All of this is really up in the air.
Right.
And even more so, again, do they want to prosecute it? Is any prosecutor going to want to waste the time going, the 3rd plant had a little bud on it, are we going to really waste?
I will tell you, if and when we find out about that, we'll be sure to let everybody know exactly which prosecutor that will be. So outdoor cultivation is going to be allowed, but
with certain caveats.
Provided certain caveats. So in an enclosed space. So that means probably I got to have a fence around my plant.
I would say that's an absolute guarantee. You're going to want at least probably a 10-foot high privacy fence that's going to block out any potential view.
Right.
But then again,
probably not a chain link fence. Probably throw at least some black some black plastic around the sides just so you're.
I have a feeling anything visible is going to attract attention. Attention is going to attract problems.
Right. So, kind of within your personal grow, one thing that was debated quite a bit is that you are going to be allowed in your dwelling to keep your entire harvest. So however amount of buds your plants produce, you are allowed to keep that in a secure in a securely stored location inside your house.
Absolutely.
It's not for distribution. You know, you can't say I grew, you know, a pound off this plant and now it's in my car and that's okay. No. But inside your house, you can legally possess as much as your legal amount of plants yield.
Right. When
correct?
When they talk about the legal limit being the you know, an ounce, that is, you know, in public, that's on your person, that's carrying, that's transporting around. In the privacy of your home, you can have as much cannabis as you want.
Okay. And again, these laws are, this is version kind of 1.0.
Oh, absolutely.
And we're not even in tax and regulate. I mean, we're not even going to talk about that tonight. We're going to save that for, we'll probably just have you back here once a month to work through all these things.
Once a month, because every month the things are going to change and they're going to be interpreted. So what I'm talking about today, 6 months from now, will most likely, a lot of the things we're talking about will have changed or will be different.
Well, and we're going to have a much greater understanding too, because after, you know, the legislature will break in early May, and it's pretty unlikely. There are a few bills that are still in play. S-216, a medical marijuana update, which has some big testing implications, including for hemp. But it's unlikely that they add a whole other set of cannabis rules and laws right now.
I'm jumping a little bit.
Pretty much what we have right now is going to be, this is what we're going to have until at least next January.
Until next tax and reg. And that's really, because then when the administrative agencies have control of it after the tax and reg system, that's when they can make a lot of tweaks and changes.
Right.
And so I am jumping the gun a little bit, but it's inevitable. We're getting there. I fully believe we will see tax and reg on July 1st, 2019.
I think that's probably, you know, I think whether it goes into effect then or September, I think that you're probably right. And I know that you've spent a lot of time looking at other states and kind of what they're doing as well. For people that are, what do you think it's going to look like as far as people from out of state coming into Vermont, right? I mean, we talk about, and I guess this is a good segue to talk about gifting. So cannabis distribution on July 1st. It will be legal to possess. It will be legal to cultivate. It will not be legal to sell. And this is still a huge misconception, even being down in Boston, you know, like last week, we're doing it DC style.
Yep.
So what is the gifting? Is gifting really going to be allowed? Like, kind of where are those lines? Because you can't sell cannabis for dollars.
Right.
Right?
So this requires a little bit of
and disclaimer, this is not legal advice. Disclaimer, this is not legal advice. Okay.
It does require a little bit of statutory interpretation, though. So most states that you've seen recreational laws passed, there is affirmative language in the statutes that state that distribution in small quantities is not illegal. That way, handing you a joint or passing a bowl wouldn't result in a distribution charge.
Right.
Vermont does not affirmatively allow it, but it is a process of, because it doesn't say you can't, you can. The statutes in Vermont specifically forbid distribution or sales of cannabis in quantities of 1 ounce or above. And it's tiered. So if 1 ounce, 2 ounces is a certain set of penalties, 2 ounces and above is a certain set of penalties.
And those include criminal penalties too.
They are all criminal penalties.
That's right. So if you are distributing more than 1 ounce, and by that we mean selling, you are going to face criminal penalties.
You will absolutely be prosecuted.
The tone of probably trying to set some boundaries and some precedents, there could be people who are going to be made examples of, especially early on.
There are going to be a lot of test cases. Again, that's a whole other topic we could talk about. Everybody wants the law to be in their favor, so everyone's going to be pushing it at first. But back to as far as the gifting, in quantities under 1 ounce, the statutes specifically forbid sales of quantities under 1 ounce of cannabis. However, the distribution language was removed, is not present. So by virtue of statutory interpretation, the kind of concept, since it is included in quantities above, but the legislature chose not to include it in quantities underneath, distribution, which is defined as the transfer for no value, is legal. The question is whether or not in these gifting scenarios where people sell a $100 Snickers bar or a $50 t-shirt, whether an individual county state's attorney may decide to try to prosecute that as a de facto sale. That's a great question. I can't help but think that some ambitious prosecutor is going to try.
And especially depending on, you talk about one of the themes through this, I think that's really interesting, is the leeway that prosecutors have individually. And how laws might be interpreted in different counties in Vermont. Because we really don't have any county government in Vermont, but this is one area where different prosecutors for different counties could approach this totally differently.
That's where this becomes three-dimensional chess, because not only do you have these laws and you have to interpret them, you have to interpret them in 14 different ways for, all intents and purposes, because of the unbelievable autonomy that each individual county state's attorney has in Vermont. You can and do often get dramatically different results and dramatically different interpretations, dramatically different prioritization of certain things based on the counties you're in. Prosecutions in Bennington County, for example, do not resemble the same type of prosecutions you'll see in Chittenden County.
And that's and we don't need to go county by county tonight. That's why you hire Tim directly.
And
he'll sit down and talk with you.
And I absolutely, that is one of the conversations I have with my clients. Where are you? What are you doing? What is your plans? And my advice does vary in some degree, based on what county my client happens to be in.
And that's kind of part of where we're at. Generally, just this sort of being the great unknown.
Of course.
We have perceptions of what local counties and what towns and what parts of cities or venues might be more or less interested in hosting this.
Right.
But we're going to see who's going to take a more aggressive approach and who's going to sit back. And that map in August 2018 might look very different in August 2019.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's why we want people to engage, and that's why it's important to go and talk with officials and say, hey, zoning board, what's the plan? Right now, let's take events, for instance, because this is something we're in the middle of thinking about.
Absolutely.
As people that plan cannabis events and, strictly compliant, legal, fun for everybody cannabis events is, how is each local body going to approach that? And what's the playbook for trying to do that? So I know that's one service that you provide, and
absolutely.
working with businesses. Actually, we had a great suggestion from JT here, Front Porch Forum. Actually a pretty interesting way to, for free, get a little local heat check and think about how your town is maybe approaching
You'll find out if they're negative real quick.
Yeah, and maybe throw up a question. And that's something you as an advocate at home watching this can do. You can say, hey, we're going to have a cannabis meetup. And just on your local Front Porch Forum, say, hey, come to the coffee shop in Charlotte.
Oh, absolutely.
Wednesday morning if you're interested and want to talk.
Get it out
maybe
there.
You get a counselor or a select board member who comes and joins you eventually. But
have that discussion, have that conversation. I think that it's a responsibility of anyone getting into the industry right now should be devoting at least some time to public education.
Right.
Again, whether it's like we talked about before with know your rights in terms of what people can and can't do, but also to educate and kind of clear up some of the misperceptions that I think some people do have that unfortunately prohibitionists have put out there.
Well, and so again, knowing this is not legal advice, we know that we can't. They have not defined how you dispense or how you gift, right? They have not said no gifting of cannabis under an ounce.
Yeah, the statute doesn't say anything about gifting.
What's your interpretation, or sort of what's your non-legal advice take on the approach to genetics? And I mean, particularly clones or even seeds. If I came and approached you and said, hey, I want to sell clones, unrooted in water cuttings, or I want to sell seeds. Seeds, it seems like there's some language that you can use online, but what's generally, what do you tell people?
So one of the conversations I have with all my clients, one of our first conversations right after that this is federally illegal, is, of course, is that this is an industry that is not risk-free. Obviously, at this stage of the game, no matter what you're doing in the cannabis industry, hemp included, there is a level of risk. That risk can be small and that risk can increase. So these are the type of conversations, certain decisions will increase your level of risk. Now with seeds, seedlings, clones, selling small scale, trading, swapping, I think that that's going to put you in that lowest tier of risk. I don't see anyone anywhere in Vermont looking to prosecute that type of behavior after July 1st. What I do see problems with is people who are running businesses, putting ads on Craigslist, running a delivery service that are blatantly, giving away large quantities of weed with overpriced merchandise. You know, not to say that I don't believe that's legal, because under the laws, I think it is legal. However,
well, and I think there will probably be a lot of that going on. The question is which one of those is going to be the one that
level
gets
of
busted.
risk, and it's going to be
so stay off Craigslist. Maybe we can say at least as a base, at least make them work for it.
Again, that
right?
comes with
Okay.
Craigslist definitely adds to that risk. And I tell everybody that wants to get involved in that, and I have had several people call me interested in getting into that kind of business, is that they're going to be test cases. And there's no question about it. And it may not be the very first person, but it may be one in a certain county. And there will be a test case. Now, just because somebody is cited and charged with a crime, that doesn't mean that they're guilty. It doesn't mean they're going to be convicted. And even if they are, it doesn't mean that that's going to be upheld on appeal. So a lot of these test cases are going to be cases which I foresee will go to the Supreme Court ultimately, and going to have to be decided on.
And that's why it's great to have a familiar face here, just in case you are one of those people.
You know,
and that's why, you know, again, being sort of proactive. Have you had people? We get a lot of questions about CBD hemp. You know, have you had people asking you questions about that? Right now, CBD hemp is fairly to very unregulated in Vermont.
We're
is
really
that something
blessed by that, actually. We're very, very fortunate in that regard. Technically, though, if we want to get down to it, this is one of the most interesting kind of dualities, is while the state is unbelievably supportive of its hemp program. If you look at the statute, the authorization statutes for hemp, it has a signing statement basically gushing about the benefits of hemp and how much the legislature supports it. But yet, if you look at the Farm Act for 2014, which basically authorizes states, there is language that can be interpreted as meaning any hemp being grown needs to be done under a pilot program, pilot research program.
Right.
That definition's a little squishy. So, but technically it could be argued that even in such a supportive state like this, hemp growers are in fact violating federal law. I don't believe our U.S. attorney here in Vermont would ever prosecute any cases like that, but you know, it's difficult when people want a solid answer. Can I do this? We have had none of the problems with CBDs in other states. Alabama, there was recently a raid, or Mississippi maybe. Tennessee, there was a raid of several, and then they had to give them back a couple weeks later after people's businesses are shut down. We've had none of that here, but I will tell you, I've had a few of my clients have lease issues, leasing land, because the landowners were still concerned specifically about that requirement in the Farm Act of 2014 that requires pilot programs.
I see. And you know, again, like this is sort of, it's really interesting. I had a conversation with a real estate broker. You know, you as an attorney, the more that this is becoming, it's a sign of normalization.
It is.
You know, right? The fact that now all of these other professional services are getting involved.
So a lot of what I've done over the last 4 months is, at least for the Burlington kind of area, is start to try to make those connections, property management, insurance, banking, and try to put together a network for when the time comes, having those resources to be able to go to, forestall kind of planning in advance, getting this all ready rather than trying to scramble at the last minute.
Well, and that's why I know, you know, one of the things where you've been starting to see some really good feedback is working with all these cannabis companies.
That's incredible.
You know, I mean, and same thing, you know, with us. We're working with them at farmers markets and talking about, you know, ads and events and all this great stuff.
Incredible.
You know, and that's what we all sort of, I think, share in this experience, is that people are really starting out. And people in Vermont, they don't want to push the limits necessarily. You know, they would rather ask the questions first. You know, they don't want to end up with 1,000 pounds of you know, super illegal something, or have to answer those questions in court. So I know people who are interested in starting these businesses, you know, some people who are asking us right now online, can I do a delivery, you know, can I do a delivery service in Rutland? Whatever that laugh says and all,
that would not be one of my top counties, no.
That's pretty good. I would only advertise it on Heady, Vermont if I was going to do it. That's probably what my advice
again,
would
you know,
be.
it's going to be the thing, no matter what county you're in, the likelihood of becoming a test case. And I would say that the likelihood of becoming a test case in Rutland County would be amongst the higher of the counties.
Right.
A higher level of risk.
We have questions, and I want to answer some of the Facebook questions too. People asking about transporting CBD across state lines.
Once you cross state lines, now you're implicating federal law. I personally would argue that you have no problem. I think it is pretty well established at this point, although there is a case pending to determine whether or not the DEA has administrative authority to classify CBD as Schedule 1, as they have claimed. I think it's a pretty clear legal argument that they do not have that authority. I don't see the legislator having any interest, and with the recent findings by the World Health Organization that CBD posed no threat nor any chance of addiction, it's non-psychoactive. I would strongly, advise my clients that they would be okay crossing state lines. But that doesn't mean that certain states, they wouldn't be prosecuted. As recently as a few months ago, the Attorney General of Oklahoma was still taking a hard, fast position that CBD was illegal.
Sure. And it depends, again, what you mean by distributing across state lines.
Right.
I mean,
you're carrying it, or you're selling it. Or
there are a dozen companies, who we know of in Vermont, who are doing CBD product sales online right now.
Absolutely.
And doing it over the internet.
Absolutely.
So the idea that you could, drive your products from Brattleboro area over to Massachusetts to a CBD store or to a co-op or something seems pretty sanitary. But if you're driving a van full of CBD flower, vacuum sealed,
again, that
through
level of risk.
Like,
level of
risk.
It's all level of risk. There's no clear, bright line, yes or no answers yet, and there may never be. Hopefully, we'll have a little clearer picture. But I think at the end of the day, if there's people who want to try to prosecute this, they're going to come up with arguments to make it so. The question is whether or not ultimately a jury would convict. And I think at this part, you're seeing, this point in time, you're seeing CBD become so accepted, and the benefit being so clearly seen by so many people that it's going to be real hard pressed to find 12 people who feel that anybody should be convicted for it, even if it was brought.
Well, I think jury nullification, right?
We're not allowed to say that word, but yes, it's exactly.
Okay. You're not allowed to say. You're not
I'm
allowed
not allowed
to say
to.
that
Not
word.
in front of a jury, anyway.
Yeah, I'm not in front of it. Yeah, I'm not licensed by any state or federal.
But this is reality, and its reality is that the government can only enforce laws that the population doesn't believe in for so long, because eventually they're not going to get their convictions. The stories of the prohibitionists, all the gloom and doom, the whole reasons that cannabis was ever made illegal in the first place were not based on reality. They were not based on any risk to the public. It's clear as day that they were based on racism and xenophobia and outgrouping. And I think that's not even debatable at this point. And then it was just exacerbated during the Nixon administration.
Well, and we're seeing, that's why this is so interesting, being in this transitional period, right?
Fantastic.
I mean, I'd rather, ideally, not
Reality,
being in this
facts.
transitional period in handcuffs, but, it is so interesting just sort of seeing what's happening. And I know we're paying close attention to what's happening in these other states, but good reminder that what happens in Mass and Maine and how they treat it is not going to be the same as here in Vermont.
No, not at all.
Do you think that we're going to be in a different space at the federal level in the next 3, 5, 10 years?
I was having this discussion just the other night with Tim from Entrepreneur, and he's of the 4-year camp. I believe it's going to happen a lot quicker. I think we're going to start to see, but it's not going to be all overnight. It's not going to be legalization. I think we'll first see by the end of this year a banking change. I think there will be some sort of guidance, some sort of indication allowing for banking services, expanding the availability of banking services.
There's too much money not to get it in the pipeline somewhere.
And Washington, like much of the country, we're on the East Coast here. Yeah, it's happening out west. We don't really see it. Once Massachusetts goes, they don't know what they're in for. I mean, this is going to be the game changer. And you're seeing right now, the other day, New Jersey adding chronic pain and anxiety to their list. Their registry, in my opinion, is about to jump from, I believe it's about 18,500 now, roughly. Probably going to 10 times that by the end of the year.
I like that approach, though, because they're building up all this capacity through the medical.
Right.
And they're saying, look, we can help a lot of people who are sick and suffering now and build our institutional capacity in the meantime.
Absolutely.
Right? We're going to need supply for 20 million people.
Of course.
So let's start with 20,000 sick ones today.
Right. And the addition of anxiety onto qualifying conditions is going to dramatically increase any state's medical program. That's going to qualify a lot more people, which in turn will create a more robust system.
Yep.
But that will also start to take away some of the stigma of full rec legalization.
Yep.
Because if 60% of the state is qualified under their medical programs, it's going to be really hard pressed to say, why don't we just legalize for recreational adult use?
Right. Well, and I have a question that came through the Facebook that if I didn't ask this, people would be up my ass like the suppository cup yesterday. What about concentrates? Right now in the law, I believe it is written.
I was just talking to Trip about this.
Okay, so it's right now in the law. I think it's written that you can possess 5 grams of hash.
Correct.
Right. So you can have 1 ounce of flour.
Yep.
And or question mark?
Again, not
5 grams of hash.
Not real clear, but I would argue that they're separate and distinct.
Okay. And they call it hash. The statute says that you cannot produce butane or hexane oil extract.
Correct.
That's the only concentrate that right now is explicitly forbidden.
And it's the process of making it with those particular
things.
methods.
You are allowed to make concentrates without using butane or hexane.
Correct.
Under the current
Framework.
sort of paradigm.
And it doesn't forbid CBD extraction with those methods either, although I'm really recommending to my clients that they get away and head towards some critical CO2.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, really? So technically, BHO for CBD.
At this point, I'm
theoretically. I mean, there's really no. The state put a. I'll tell you. I'll tell you in my legal advice. I've seen a lot of law enforcement activity on BHO. That is a very sore point, and it's not worth being a test case.
They evacuated an entire city block in Winooski.
Yes.
They sent in hazmat teams.
Yeah, Winooski,
talk about
my town.
Overkill.
Yes. By the way, I'm pretty sure no charges came out of that. just as a little follow-up. But concentrates, you know, theoretically, just like I could possess an ounce, I could possess up to 5 grams of shatter, of rosin. I mean, you can't produce BHO, but you could theoretically, if I grow bud and I put it in a, hair straightener and make my own live resin for my own dabs, then I could theoretically possess 5 grams of
Remember, if you're home, you can possess as much as you want.
Right. If you're home,
carried around in person,
if you're home, you have a legal chain of custody.
And then bringing it back here.
Okay.
Which is what's going to be happening.
Well, and that's, I mean, it's. Listen, I don't spoiler alert. I hope I'm not giving away the whole underground here, but there's a fair amount of concentrates already out there.
Of course.
None of them are really, at least the ones that have labels and quality and badass Instagram profiles, they're not here in Vermont. So there's a lot moving across state lines, and we know that there are people in Vermont who want to make, concentrates. And I guess the next logical question is, how do edibles factor into that, right? Because I can, at my house, I grew a big ass plant outside. I harvested a pound. I cooked it into butter. I made, a billion cookies, and I gifted them all out to my friends, because I'm such a generous person, with no financial considerations at all.
What a guy!
But what about like possessing? Yeah, it's just that kind of guy. What about possessing edibles?
So our current statute as written, our legalization statute, so to say, is pretty light on detail. Details like concentrates, like edibles. There really is not much right now. I don't think it's going to stay that way.
Yeah.
But this opens up questions like, okay, so in the example you just gave, how much did the cookies weigh? Let's say one of those cookies weighed over an ounce. Would that be enough for some prosecutor in, Bennington County or Orleans County to say that is the distribution of cannabis in quantities above an ounce because it had a concentrate baked into the baked good and that the carrier weight constituted the weight?
Right.
They could.
You hear stories about like Texas, like kids get charged with possession of 20 pounds because they got a tray of brownies.
Absolutely. Sugar cubes and acid was the big case, and the court found the carrier weight. But there's a whole new ballgame. Could they try it? Sure. Do I think they're going to get a conviction again? Police can recommend charges, prosecutors can bring charges, but at the end of the day, are they going to really convict? And I have a hard time believing anybody in Vermont is going to convict you for a cookie. Doesn't say you couldn't be a test case.
Right. And again, it depends if you're out there buying Facebook ads for, Doobie's space cookies, delivered 3 for
6 foot joint on top of your car
joints.
Driving around Shelburne, you might have a problem.
Yeah, and maybe, I guess that's kind of a good place to sort of wrap it up, knowing that we don't have these kind of specific answers yet.
Not yet, but we will.
We will.
We will.
And we'll be out there telling you, and
hopefully
you'll be out there
some of
telling, oh my gosh, and maybe just kind of as a good way to sum it up, that sort of, I'll summarize not your statements, but kind of the general tone of, don't be an asshole about it. You know, I mean, just really, like, don't be an asshole about it.
Be smart.
Like you said, don't be confrontational. And I don't think, you know, thankfully, people who follow Heady Vermont, you know, people who are involved in cannabis in Vermont, they know how to act. You guys know how to act. We're all adults here.
And if I can add just one thing to that, patience. Because it's not going to stay like this. The heavy regulation, the extreme is going to fade away. As people see that the gloom and doom predictions don't come true, 6-year-olds will not be running around with joints, the roads will not turn into bumper cars, people won't be jumping off buildings. In fact, not much is going to change, and all of the fear and all of the apprehension surrounding cannabis legalization will evaporate, and the people who have been most advocate will find something else to get upset about.
That is, yes, that I can believe that, no matter what. We love them all. Not as much as we love you, Tim. Thank you very much.
Thank
this
you,
has
Eli.
been our guest.
Really appreciate it, brother.
Tim Fair. Tim, where's the best way for people to track you down? Vermont Cannabis Solutions?
www.Vermont Cannabis Solutions. Heady Vermont, call Eli.
You're out here. I was going to say, you'll be here. You'll be speaking at NECAN at the Vermont Cannabis and Hemp Convention.
I'm certainly hoping so. I'm looking forward to it
May
very
12th
much so.
and 13th. You can get in touch with Tim. I will, unsolicited. There's been no financial consideration for any of this. But Tim's the guy who we call.
Well, thank
you. Know,
Eli.
when we have questions here as well, and we can personally
I'm not hard
attest
to find.
The great service. Yeah, he's sneaky tall. We got him on the little couch
that like
today,
a sore thumb.
You know, because I need it. But no, thank you guys all for tuning in.
Thanks so
you
much.
have more questions? Check out Vermont Cannabis Solutions. Otherwise, Tim Fair, thank you again for being here tonight. All right. Have a good night.